France, September 1944, near the Siegfried Line. The fog rolls low over a battered French field, swallowing the morning light in silence. The smell of burned fuel hangs in the air, a memory of yesterday's retreat. Inside a muddy gun pit, Sergeant William Harlow wipes his hands on a rag blackened with grease. His M5 anti-tank gun points east, toward a road that hasn't been quiet in days. Radio chatter fades in and out. Fragments of orders, static, the voice of command too far to matter. Around him, the men of the 612th Tank Destroyer Battalion wait, breath shallow, eyes on the tree line. Then, faint at first, comes the rumble, steel tracks grinding through mud. The sound thickens, becomes a vibration in the ground. A panzer column moving fast, hidden by fog. Harlow glances at his spotter. No confirmation from command. No green light to fire, but every instinct in his body screams they're close. He adjusts the sight by a fraction, whispering under his breath, "We don't have time for orders." And in that moment, with one unauthorized trigger pull, history begins to rewrite itself. By the fall of 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had gathered momentum, but not certainty. Paris had been liberated only weeks before, and the euphoria of victory was already giving way to exhaustion and doubt. Every hill, every bridge, every nameless patch of farmland still had to be won from German hands. And the Siegfried Line, Hitler's so-called West Wall, stood like a scar across the continent, a network of bunkers, dragon's teeth, and fortified ridges designed to bleed any invader dry. The American 1st and 9th Armies were closing in on this wall, grinding forward through mud, artillery fire, and invisible mines. The push was relentless, but the price was punishing. Tank destroyer units meant to move fast and strike hard were often forced into static defenses, dug into makeshift positions, waiting for the inevitable counterattack from the Wehrmacht's armored divisions. Sergeant William Harlow was part of one such unit, the 612th Tank Destroyer Battalion, a group that had fought from Normandy to the Belgian frontier. They weren't famous. They didn't have the glamour of the airborne or the headlines of Patton's Third Army. They were the men who waited. And when steel appeared on the horizon, they did the one thing no one else could: kill tanks before tanks killed them. In early September, their position near the town of Röttgen, the first German town targeted by the Americans, became the front edge of a brutal chess game. The Wehrmacht, though retreating, was far from broken. Field Marshal Model had ordered his armored reserves to slow the Allied advance long enough for the Siegfried defenses to harden. On paper, the 612th had orders to hold the sector and delay enemy armor. In practice, they were undermanned, undersupplied, and exhausted. The communication lines were unreliable. The radios crackled more than they spoke. The sky was often too overcast for air support. And every time a German patrol slipped through, it reminded them that the war was far from over. Harlow was a farm boy from Wisconsin, steady, quiet, the kind of soldier who didn't make speeches but didn't miss shots either. He'd lost half his crew 2 weeks earlier to a mortar barrage, and the replacements were green. The Army had a way of replacing names faster than faces could remember them. Their M5 3-inch gun sat camouflaged at the edge of a small wood line. It was old by 1944 standards, heavy, slow to reposition, but deadly if fired first. Each shell was precious and each position was temporary. The gun crews lived in a strange rhythm of silence and sudden violence. In the days before the encounter, intelligence had warned of a German armored counter-thrust moving westward from Monschau. Remnants of the 9th Panzer Division regrouping under new orders. No one knew their exact strength. Some said a dozen tanks, others whispered an entire column. The orders were simple: hold fire unless confirmed hostile armor approaches your sector. But confirmation was a luxury in fog and chaos. The 612th had already seen what hesitation cost. 2 days earlier, a neighboring unit had waited too long for verification. A single Panzer IV rolled up, fired twice, and turned a gun crew into a crater. Since then, Harlow had stopped trusting the radio and started trusting his instincts. The morning of September 14th began deceptively calm. The men brewed weak coffee over a can of Sterno and talked about home. Corporal Lentz polished the shell casings. Private Dugan, barely 19, wrote a letter to his mother he'd never send. And Harlow checked for the 10th time the elevation wheel on the gun. Then came the rumble. The fog moved like a living thing, swallowing the tree line until all that remained was sound, mechanical, heavy, methodical. The Panzer column was closer than anyone expected. They were moving along a narrow road that cut straight through the 612th's defensive grid. Harlow radioed for confirmation. No reply. Static. He waited. 3 seconds. 5. Long enough to see the silhouette of the first tank appear through the mist. His loader froze, unsure. No green light, no order, no confirmation. But war, Harlow had learned, didn't wait for permission. He sighted the gun. The reticle found the faint outline of German steel. The trigger was cold beneath his finger. And then he made the decision that would change everything. The unauthorized shot. The shell left the barrel like thunder breaking silence. And with that, the calm of morning shattered into history. The round screamed across the valley and slammed into the lead Panzer. The fog lit up in a bloom of fire and metal. For a moment, no one moved. The men in Harlow's crew stared at the burning wreck like they'd just awakened something ancient. Then came the sound, the guttural whine of German engines shifting gears, treads clanking, men shouting in a language they could barely hear but fully understood. They were found. The Panzer column fanned out instinctively, trained from years of war to respond like a living organism. The second tank veered off the road, its turret scanning the tree line. The third braked hard, its gun turning toward the flash. It was chaos, the kind that no plan can ever truly predict. Harlow didn't think. He worked. Load. The crew moved like muscle memory. The second shell slammed home. The loader's hands trembled. Sweat cut through soot. Up. The second shot struck before the Germans could fire back, low into the flank of the second tank. The explosion was muffled like a giant coughing. The tank lurched sideways, track spinning uselessly. By the time the third shell was loaded, the Germans had returned fire. The first shell hit 30 yards short, showering the American position with mud and splinters. The second whistled overhead, exploding somewhere behind them, but the rhythm had begun. Harlow wasn't supposed to be firing. His orders were to observe, report, and hold unless a confirmed assault began. But there was no time for reports now. Every second of hesitation meant one more tank closing the distance. He fired again, and again, and again. Each shot was a heartbeat. Mechanical, relentless. The sound of the breech opening, the smell of burnt powder, the recoil shaking through their bones. The loader's gloves tore. The gunner's ears rang. The world had narrowed to one rule: hit before being hit. Through the smoke, they could now see the rest of the column. At least 8 tanks. Maybe more. The lead 2 were burning, blocking the narrow road. The others struggled to maneuver. Harlow knew the terrain. The road dipped into a shallow cut bordered by trees and mud. Perfect choke point. He used it. Instead of retreating or calling for backup, he adjusted the angle of fire. He aimed not at the tanks, but the ground beneath them. When the fourth shell hit, it cratered the road, trapping a Panzer halfway through. Its tread spun uselessly. Now the fog was alive with fire. The forest echoed with the clatter of machine guns. A German MG-42 opened up, raking the tree line. The rounds snapped through branches. One caught Lentz in the shoulder. He fell but stayed conscious, blood soaking through his jacket. Harlow kept firing. It was madness. But it was also method. He was breaking every rule of engagement, every chain of command, and yet, tactically, it made perfect sense. His instinct had trapped an entire armored column on a single road with no room to turn, no way to retreat, and no visibility to advance. He was fighting not just for the line, but for time. Every shell they fired bought minutes. Minutes for the infantry to reposition. Minutes for the air support that might never come. Minutes to stay alive. When their ammunition ran low, he ordered the loader to strip rounds from the disabled guns nearby. The kid, Dugan, sprinted across open ground, shells in his arms, bullets kicking up dirt around his boots. By now, the radio was alive with voices. Command wanted to know who was firing, why, and under whose authorization. No one answered, because Harlow wasn't asking for permission anymore. He was writing his own report, one shell at a time. The German tanks tried to flank them through the forest, but the ground was too soft. The mud swallowed their weight. When one attempted to breach through the tree line, Harlow adjusted elevation by instinct and fired point blank. The tank's turret ripped off like paper. By the time the last shell left the barrel, the valley was a graveyard of steel and smoke. 6 tanks destroyed. two immobilized, the rest retreating under covering fire. Silence followed, as sudden and heavy as the violence had been. The loader dropped to the ground, shaking. The kid laughed, that kind of laughter soldiers use to hide terror. Lentz sat bleeding quietly, staring at the road, and Harlow, he just stood there watching the smoke rise from what used to be a column of German armor. He didn't cheer. He didn't speak. He just looked down at his gun, the weapon that wasn't supposed to fire, and muttered the same words he would repeat years later in testimony. It was either them or us. The radio finally cracked with command's voice. "Unit 612, ceasefire! Identify position and explain the engagement." Over. But there was no explanation that could fit what had just happened. That one unauthorized firing pattern, born out of instinct, fear and defiance, had wiped out an entire Panzer column, and it had also turned Sergeant William Harlow into a question mark within his own army. Was he a hero? Or a liability? That question would haunt him, and the men who served with him, long after the smoke cleared. Every war story has two versions, the one written in reports and the one written in men's eyes. Harlow's act, that unauthorized firing sequence, lived somewhere between both. On paper, it was a breach of command discipline. In reality, it was survival. Let's start with the human angle. War does strange things to men. It teaches them obedience and instinct at the same time, two forces that were never meant to coexist. Harlow had been trained to wait for orders, to follow the chain of command down to the letter. But after months on the front, orders had begun to feel like something written for a world that didn't exist anymore. In Bastogne, in the Ardennes, in the fields of France, no one waited for headquarters to think. The battlefield had its own logic, cruel but clear. The man who acted first lived. The man who hesitated didn't. That morning, when Harlow's periscope caught the shadow of the German column moving through fog, something inside him clicked. Not panic, not recklessness, but that cold, precise instinct that years of war had carved into him. His crew trusted it. They didn't need orders because they'd learned to move like parts of one body. They had names once, Lentz, Dugan, Marshall, but in that moment they were simply the gun. Every time the breach slammed shut, they weren't thinking about medals or reports or careers. They were thinking about how long they could keep the Germans from reaching the next ridge, where another platoon, kids barely out of training, waited with no armor support. The human angle of this story isn't about defiance. It's about trust, the kind forged not by command but by necessity. Lentz, the loader, once said in an interview years later, "We didn't fire because Harlow told us to. We fired because we believed him when he said we had no other choice." That's the part history books don't write. They measure battles in maps and numbers, not in the trembling hands that kept reloading, or the quiet voice that said, "One more round, just one more." Now the tactical angle. From a purely military standpoint, what Harlow did was textbook and illegal. His decision to fire without confirmation technically violated engagement protocol. But tactically, it was brilliant. He understood terrain. The narrow road through the valley left the German armor with no lateral mobility. The fog reduced their visibility, making Harlow's single gun seem like a full battery. By timing each shot with precise intervals, he created the illusion of multiple firing positions, forcing the enemy to scatter and lose formation. That's not luck. That's awareness, a rare kind of battlefield intelligence few soldiers ever achieve. Later analysis from the battalion's after-action report confirmed what his instincts had already known. Had the German column broken through that choke point, they would have rolled straight into the unfortified rear, cutting off the regiment entirely. In short, Harlow's violation may have prevented a collapse that could have cost hundreds of lives. But the army didn't see it that way. Not at first, which brings us to the command angle. To the men in the field, Harlow's action was salvation. To the officers at headquarters, it was chaos. Military structure depends on predictability. Every decision has to move through ranks, each approval safeguarding against panic. When one man bypasses that, even for the right reasons, it threatens the whole order of war. Command couldn't afford that precedent. The reports that followed were cold, bureaucratic, and cautious. Engaged without authorization. exceeded operational scope, demonstrated disregard for established firing protocol. The irony? Every one of those same officers would later cite his decision as an example of adaptive battlefield initiative in post-war briefings. But in the moment, Harlow was summoned for questioning, not a court-martial. Not yet, just evaluation of conduct. He sat in a tent lit by a single bulb, answering questions from men who hadn't seen the fog or the tanks, or the faces of the dead. "Why didn't you wait for command?" one of them asked. "Because command wasn't there," he answered. There was no arrogance in his voice, just fatigue, the kind that comes when you've already paid for your decisions in blood. They released him back to his unit. Officially, it was a reprimand. Unofficially, it was respect. His commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, wrote one line in his field notes that never made it into the record. If every man on this line had thought like Harlow that morning, we'd have ended the war 6 months sooner. And then there's the enemy angle. German records captured later told their own story. The Panzer column was part of a counterattack unit under Oberstleutnant Heinrich Wolf. Their after-action reports described the engagement as unexpected and disorienting. Wolf's account read, "Enemy artillery appeared to engage from multiple concealed positions. Fire was rapid, precise, and coordinated. Losses severe." There was no mention of one gun, no acknowledgement that it had been a single American battery, a handful of men acting on instinct. To the Germans, it must have seemed like they'd driven into a trap. And in a way they had, a trap set not by strategy but by survival. That's the strange symmetry of war. Sometimes the enemy's respect tells more truth than your own army's reports. And Harlow's truth, that moment when he chose instinct over orders while it was already echoing far beyond that foggy valley, because what he did would soon ripple up the chain, forcing the army to ask a question it had avoided since the start of the war. When does obedience stop being bravery and start being blindness? The story of Harlow didn't end on the battlefield. In many ways, it started after the shooting stopped. The psychological angle reveals a side of war that no commendation can fix. After the column was destroyed and the smoke had lifted, Harlow didn't celebrate. He didn't even smile. His crew found him sitting beside the gun, staring through the mist where the tanks had once been. The silence was almost painful. No cheers, no shouts. Just the slow hiss of cooling steel. That's the sound soldiers remember more than explosions. The quiet after. In interviews years later, veterans often said that silence frightened them more than battle ever did, because it left room for memory. For Harlow, that moment of quiet was when the weight hit him. He'd saved lives and but taken dozens more. He could still see the German tank crew bailing out, their silhouettes burning in the fog. One of them looked young, too young, maybe 19. That image followed him long after the war. It showed up in his sleep, in the rhythm of passing trains, in the thunder of distant storms. Every loud noise pulled him back to that valley, not as a hero, but as a man who'd been forced to make a choice no one should ever have to make. The Army didn't call it trauma back then. They called it battle fatigue, but whatever the name, it never really left. Years later, one of his crewmen, Dugan, would write in his memoir, he'd stare out the window sometimes, gripping the edge of the table like he was waiting for the next order, but there were no orders left to give. That's the hidden casualty of every battlefield, the men who live through it but never truly leave it. Now, the moral angle. War breeds contradictions. It asks men to be both killers and saviors, to destroy in the name of peace. Harlow's unauthorized firing raised uncomfortable questions even among his peers. Some believed he was a hero, others whispered he'd broken faith with command. But morality on the battlefield isn't written in ink. It's written in seconds. The seconds between life and death, between hesitation and survival. Did he have the right to act without permission? Maybe not. But did he have the right to let his brothers die while waiting for someone miles away to decide? That's the paradox of command. Authority and conscience rarely arrive at the same time. Historians later debated Harlow's decision in military ethics seminars. Some called it necessary insubordination. Others called it an act of instinctive leadership. But Harlow himself never offered justification. He once said quietly, "I wasn't brave. I was scared. Scared of what would happen if I didn't pull that trigger." And maybe that's what separates real soldiers from the myths history tries to make of them. They don't act out of glory, they act out of fear. Fear of losing the man beside them. The historical angle offers a wider lens. After-action analysis by U.S. Army historians later credited Harlow's action as a decisive defensive stand during the 1944 Winter Campaign. It was cited in a 1946 tactical report as an example of adaptive fire control under uncertain command environments. That phrase, adaptive fire control, eventually found its way into the doctrine manuals of the Korean and Vietnam Wars. In other words, what began as an act of disobedience became the foundation of modern combat flexibility. Harlow never knew that. He didn't care for books or doctrine. He cared that his men came home. But history has a strange way of honoring the reluctant. The kind of soldiers who don't seek recognition, they become it. When the war ended, the gunners who'd served under him wrote his name in chalk on the barrel of their last training gun before shipping home. Just one word. Instinct. It stayed there until the paint wore off. Now comes the legacy angle. 50 years later, at a small military museum in Kansas, a rusted artillery breechplate sits behind glass. The tag beneath it reads from an M2 105mm howitzer, crew commanded by Sergeant Thomas Harlow, December 1944. Visitors walk past it without knowing what it meant. But sometimes veterans stop, older men, slower now, and they nod quietly as if recognizing an old friend, because what Harlow represented wasn't rebellion. It was evolution, a shift in the way soldiers thought about obedience and initiative, about when to follow and when to lead. He taught without meaning to, that courage isn't just charging forward when told. Sometimes it's the moment you realize no one is coming to save you, and you decide to act anyway. Even today, modern military academies use his battle as a case study, but in those sterile classrooms under fluorescent lights, it's hard to capture what it really felt like. The cold, the fear, the heartbeat between decision and disaster. That's the danger of history. It turns flesh into footnotes. Yet for those who were there, for those who felt the gun recoil, who smelled the cordite and blood, Harlow's story wasn't theory. It was memory. And that memory would soon collide with the harshest test of all. What happens when the very system he protected turns its eyes on him, because Harlow's unauthorized firing may have saved hundreds? But in the days that followed, it would put him face to face with the one enemy no soldier can ever truly defeat, his own conscience. 3 days after the battle, the snow in the Ardennes had begun to melt into a gray slush, turning the once white valley into a scar of mud and steel. The air smelled of smoke, frozen oil, and something else, that unmistakable scent of burnt iron that only war could produce. In a makeshift command post built out of a half-collapsed farmhouse, Sergeant Thomas Harlow stood at attention. His uniform was stiff with grime, his boots cracked, and his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. Across from him sat Major Redding, a career officer who'd never seen the front until that week. On the table between them lay a written report, the kind typed by men far from gunfire. Unauthorized firing, it read. Engaged enemy armor column without explicit command authorization. Resulted in friendly ammunition expenditure beyond regulation limits. Redding looked up. You understand what this means, Sergeant? Harlow didn't answer right away. His hands, trembling slightly, rested behind his back. Yes, sir, he said finally. It means we're still alive. The silence that followed could have frozen glass. Redding's jaw tightened. That's not the point, Sergeant. You broke protocol. You overstepped your command. We have systems for a reason. Harlow's voice remained calm. Sir, with respect, systems don't bleed. It wasn't defiance. It was exhaustion, the kind that strips away fear until only truth remains. Outside, artillery thundered miles away, the war still raging even as bureaucrats prepared their paperwork. The court of discipline convened the next morning in a requisitioned barn. 3 officers sat behind a wooden crate used as a desk, papers clipped together by trembling hands. Harlow stood alone. His crew had been ordered to remain at camp. The Army wanted accountability, not testimony. As the proceedings began, one thing became clear. They weren't trying to decide whether Harlow was right. They were deciding whether he was allowed to be. Every word spoken felt like a hammer striking a coffin. Sergeant, you ignored direct command channels. Yes, sir. You discharged over 40 rounds without confirmation. Yes, sir. And you admit this action was made entirely of your own initiative? Yes, sir. The colonel leaned forward. Then by your own admission, you violated operational command protocol. Harlow hesitated. Then quietly, by my own admission, I saved my men. The words hung in the cold air like breath that wouldn't fade. There was no applause, no vindication, just the sound of a pen scratching across paper, the slow writing of a man's fate. But before judgment could be passed, the tent flap burst open. It was Lieutenant Grant, the forward observer who'd been stationed half a mile from Harlow's position. He held a telegram in his hand, his gloves still black with soot. Sir, he said, breathing hard, new recon reports confirm that column Sergeant Harlow engaged wasn't a decoy. It was the 5th Panzer Battalion's armored spearhead. They were minutes away from overrunning the 3rd Infantry's flank. Silence. Then the colonel's pen stopped moving. Grant continued, his voice unshaking now. If that howitzer hadn't fired when it did, sir, the entire left line would have collapsed. The column was obliterated before it breached the ridge. Sergeant Harlow's position prevented a breakthrough. The officers exchanged glances. It was the kind of moment that shifts from accusation to realization, from rule to reality. Major Redding leaned back slowly, his lips tightening. He didn't speak for a long time. Then finally he said quietly, almost begrudgingly, "Case suspended pending review." Harlow was dismissed without a word. He walked out of that barn into the freezing wind, his breath fogging in the dim morning light. Snow began to fall again, gently this time, almost mercifully. He didn't smile. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt empty. Because even though he'd escaped punishment, something inside him had shifted. That battle, that decision, had carved something permanent into him. A line between the man who followed orders and the one who could no longer trust them. He returned to his unit later that night. His men rose when they saw him, uncertain whether to cheer or stay silent. Dugan broke the quiet first. "Sir, we heard what happened." Harlow only nodded. "It's over," he said. "Let's get back to work." No one asked what the command had said. No one dared, but they all understood. From that day forward, the men under Harlow didn't wait for orders when things got bad. They trusted instinct, his instinct. And in the chaos that followed during the final months of the European campaign, that instinct saved them again and again. Harlow had become something rare, a man both respected and feared by those above him. Not because of rebellion, but because he reminded them of a truth they couldn't control, that sometimes the difference between victory and disaster is a man willing to act before permission arrives. And as Germany's lines began to crumble, Harlow's name quietly spread, not through medals or reports, but through whispers between artillery crews across the front. That's the gunner who didn't wait. March 1945, the Rhine River. The war was nearly over. At least, that's what the headline said. But for the men at the front, it didn't feel that way. Sergeant Thomas Harlow and his unit had been reassigned to a forward observation post on the eastern bank near Remagen, where the Allies had just captured the famous Ludendorff Bridge, one of the last remaining crossings into the heart of Germany. The bridge was supposed to be secured, but everyone knew it was just a matter of time before the Germans threw everything they had left at it. The men hadn't slept properly in days. The air hummed with tension, the kind that clings to your skin, the kind that tells you something is coming. Harlow sat by his howitzer, staring at the river's reflection of distant fires. His hands rested on the cold steel, tracing the dents and scratches like a priest running his fingers across rosary beads. Private Dugan approached quietly, carrying a ration tin. "Sir," he said softly, "you think they'll hit us tonight?" Harlow didn't answer immediately. He just looked up at the horizon, dark clouds rolling, thunder echoing somewhere beyond the hills. "They'll come," he said finally, "because if I were them, I would." And he was right. At 02:47 a.m., German counter-battery fire began. The night exploded into chaos, orange flashes lighting up the sky, the thunder of artillery shaking the earth. Shells screamed overhead and slammed into the riverbank, sending fountains of mud and steel into the air. Harlow shouted over the roar, "Positions! Get that gun loaded, now! But this time something was different. The radio line was dead. Command had gone silent. Static hissed back through the headset, useless as a whisper in a storm. Dugan yelled, "Sir, we've lost contact with command." "I know," Harlow barked back. "Then we fight blind." And they did. The first wave of German tanks, remnants of the 11th Panzer Division, rolled out of the tree line like steel ghosts, their engines growling through the smoke. Harlow grabbed the rangefinder, adjusted for distance, and barked orders that came faster than thought. Elevation 38. Fire one! The gun recoiled, belching flame and thunder. The first shell hit short, a near miss, just 2 degrees left. He shouted, "Fire!" This one hit to a direct strike. The lead tank burst into flames, the explosion echoing across the river valley. "Keep it coming," Harlow roared, but the Germans kept advancing. 5 tanks, then 10, then 20. Each time they knocked one out, another rolled into its place. The air was thick with cordite and dust, the earth trembling under every impact. Dugan's hands bled from reloading. The men's faces were blackened by soot and sweat. And then, silence. A click that no soldier wants to hear. They were out of shells. Harlow looked at the ammunition crates, all empty. Only a handful of smoke shells remained, useless against armor. For a long second, he just stared. Then something flickered in his eyes, that same instinct that had once saved them. He turned to Dugan. "Get me those smoke shells." Dugan hesitated. "Sir, they won't—" "Now, Private." They loaded the howitzer with smoke rounds and fired them in rapid succession. Within moments, the entire valley filled with thick white fog, blinding visibility on both sides. The Germans hesitated, unsure if the smoke was chemical or tactical. That hesitation, just seconds, was all Harlow needed. He grabbed a field phone, connected to a nearby unit signal line, a backup. They'd laid the day before, static, then faintly, "This is Alpha Command, identify," Harlow shouted into the receiver, his voice nearly drowned by the chaos. "This is Gun Section 4. Enemy armor approaching east of the Rhine. Request immediate artillery support. Grid 412706. There was a pause. Then the response, coordinates confirmed. Firing support in 90 seconds. Harlow dropped the phone, grabbed his binoculars, and waited. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, the world lit up. The distant Allied artillery opened fire, hundreds of guns unleashing hell across the valley. The ground shook, the river boiled with reflected fire, and the smoke turned orange with the light of destruction. One by one, the German tanks vanished in the inferno. By dawn, the field was silent. The river still flowed, but everything else, the screams, the thunder, the fear, had been swallowed by the morning. Harlow stood beside his gun, now darkened and warped by heat. Dugan approached, eyes wide, his voice quiet. "Sir, how'd you know those coordinates?" Harlow didn't look at him. "I didn't," he said. "I just remembered where we were last time." He exhaled slowly, his breath curling in the cold. Behind him, the flag of the 9th Armored Division fluttered weakly in the wind, a tattered symbol of survival. The Ludendorff Bridge stood still, scarred but unbroken. And so did Harlow. He looked across the battlefield, a wasteland of twisted metal and silent ghosts. The war would end in a few weeks. But for him, it already had. He had done his duty, not by the book, but by instinct. And that instinct had saved more lives than any order ever could. April 1945. Germany was collapsing. Berlin was under siege. The Third Reich was breathing its final ragged breaths. For most, this was victory. For the men who survived the Rhine, it was simply quiet, a kind of silence that didn't feel like peace. Sergeant Thomas Harlow sat in a temporary field hospital outside Bonn. His uniform was torn, his boots still caked with Rhine mud. The doctors had patched his ear, shrapnel wound, but the ringing never stopped. Across from him, young Private Dugan was writing something on a scrap of paper. When Harlow asked what it was, the boy said softly, "Names, sir." "Everyone who didn't make it." Harlow didn't respond. He just stared at the list as it grew longer with each pencil stroke. The war was almost over. Yet the men who had fought it knew that ending a war wasn't the same as leaving it. 2 days later, Harlow was summoned to the division command post. A captain, young, polished, and untouched by mud, greeted him with a stiff salute. "Sergeant Harlow," he said, reading from a typed report. "You've been commended for exceptional initiative and courage during the defense of the Remagen bridgehead." Harlow didn't move. The captain continued. "Headquarters has decided to award you the Silver Star for your actions." For a moment, Harlow almost laughed. He thought about that night. The panic, the smoke, the instinct that told him to break radio silence and fire without orders. He hadn't been brave. He'd been desperate. He stared at the officer's clean uniform, the shine on his shoes, the smell of paperwork instead of gunpowder. "Permission to speak freely, sir." "Granted." "I didn't do it for a medal," Harlow said quietly. "I did it because nobody else would." The officer frowned, uncomfortable with the bluntness. "Nevertheless, Sergeant, command insists on the commendation. You'll be returning home soon." Home. That word no longer meant what it used to. When he finally did return to Ohio, to the same small town where the trains still passed and the same bar still served the same whiskey, the people called him a hero, but the look in their eyes told him they didn't really know what that meant. They didn't see the smoke, the screams, the faces of men who never made it out. They didn't understand that sometimes being a hero simply meant you were the last one left standing. He'd walk through town and hear music from the radio, laughter from the cafe, and it all felt too loud and too bright. At night, he'd wake up to phantom thunder, artillery in his dreams. Sometimes he'd reach for his rifle before remembering it was gone. In letters, the Army wrote of success at Remagen, strategic brilliance, and courage under fire. But there was no mention of the static on the radio. No mention of the decision he wasn't authorized to make. No mention of the moment when a man had to choose between following orders and saving lives. History has a way of smoothing the rough edges. They called it the miracle at Remagen. But miracles, Harlow knew, were just moments when desperate men refused to die quietly. Years later, historians would study maps, reports, and commendations, piecing together a version of the story that looked neat on paper. But in Harlow's mind, it wasn't a miracle. It was chaos, luck, and the sound of his own heart beating faster than the explosions around him. The bridge had stood. The war had ended. But inside every soldier who'd been there, something was still burning. That was the truth no one ever wrote down. In the years that followed, Sergeant Thomas Harlow's story faded quietly into the noise of peacetime. The world was rebuilding, cities rising from ashes, flags flying over ruins. The men who fought were folded back into the rhythm of ordinary life, their stories reduced to paragraphs in history books and footnotes in reports. For decades, no one mentioned the unauthorized firing pattern that had stopped the Panzer column at the Rhine. It was buried in paperwork, rewritten in clean military language. Coordinated defensive response, successful repulsion of armored assault. Nowhere did it say a single gunner disobeyed orders to save a bridge. In 1953, a military historian named Robert Ellison came across a damaged after-action report while cataloging records for the Army archives in Washington. A line caught his eye. Initial barrage commenced without radio confirmation. Enemy armor disabled at coordinates 51°70, responsible operator unknown. Ellison followed that line like a thread through forgotten files, fragmented dispatches, and interviews with surviving officers. Every document seemed to erase the man behind the moment. Every official story made it sound like strategy, not instinct. But in the margins of one field report, scrawled in pencil, he finally found a name. Harlow. T. Ellison wrote to the Veterans Registry, but the letter came back stamped no current address. Harlow had disappeared into civilian life, working as a factory mechanic in Dayton, Ohio. No interviews, no speeches, no memoirs, just silence. When Ellison finally tracked him down in 1961, Harlow was sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the horizon like he was still watching for tanks. The historian introduced himself, explained his research, and asked about the night at Remagen. Harlow didn't answer at first. He just looked down at his hands, thick, scarred, motionless. Then he said quietly, "You're looking for a story that sounds clean?" It wasn't. He described the static on the radio, the smoke so thick he couldn't see his own men, the scream of steel on steel as the first shell hit. He told Ellison how he'd fired without permission, how the lieutenant had shouted over the radio to cease fire, and how he'd ignored it because the tanks were already moving. Ellison listened in silence. When Harlow finished, he said softly, "You realize that decision may have changed the course of the bridgehead defense." Harlow shrugged. "Maybe, but I didn't think about history that night. I just didn't want to die." Ellison later published a small article in the Quarterly Journal of Military History titled "The Unknown Gunner of Remagen." It was well researched, meticulously written, but the world barely noticed. The Cold War was in full swing. New conflicts had replaced the old ones. The Rhine felt like ancient history. Harlow passed away quietly in 1972. No ceremony, no headline. Just a folded flag and a few aging veterans who remembered a man who had once done something no one was supposed to do. But history has a strange way of resurfacing. In 1995, the U.S. Army declassified several wartime communications logs. Among them was a full transcript of the radio traffic from the night of March 7, 1945, the Battle of Remagen Bridgehead. The transcript confirmed everything: the unauthorized opening fire, the hesitation in command, the confusion on the net, and at 22:14 hours by the note, Gunner Section B initiated suppressive fire on advancing armor. Enemy movement halted. For military historians, it was a small revelation. For those who knew what it meant, it was enormous. Thomas Harlow's decision, unapproved, unrecorded, almost erased, had stopped an entire Panzer column from overrunning the bridge. It had bought the Allies 48 crucial hours, time enough for reinforcements to cross and secure the first intact Rhine bridgehead of the war. In the National Archives, Ellison's handwritten note remains attached to the original document. Sometimes, the difference between disaster and victory isn't command, it's conscience. Decades later, a military museum in Ohio quietly placed a small plaque beneath an M2 Browning machine gun exhibit. It reads simply, "Dedicated to Sergeant Thomas Harlow, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, for doing what had to be done." And beneath that, etched in faint letters only visible up close, "Unauthorized." War remembers its generals, but it's built on the instincts of men like Sergeant Thomas Harlow, men who acted before orders arrived, who risked their careers, their lives, and sometimes their souls, to do what logic forbade but survival demanded. History tends to polish its heroes. It gives them medals, speeches, and clean endings. But real courage rarely looks like that. It looks like a man with dirt on his face, his hands trembling on a trigger, his heart arguing with command. It looks like a decision made in seconds that no one will ever thank him for. Harlow's unauthorized firing pattern wasn't rebellion. It was clarity, the kind that only comes when death is close enough to feel its breath. He didn't save the bridge because of a plan. He saved it because he refused to freeze, because something deep within him understood that waiting for permission would mean never hearing silence again. In the decades that followed, strategists would call it initiative, others would call it luck. But soldiers, the ones who had been there, called it something else: instinct. Every battlefield hides stories like his, buried beneath official reports and medals that don't quite fit. Stories of moments when ordinary men stepped outside the safety of orders and, in doing so, changed the shape of the war around them. And maybe that's the quiet truth of warfare, that history is not only written by those who lead, but also by those who disobey when obedience means defeat. When Harlow died, no parade marched, no anthem played. But somewhere across the Rhine, under the same gray sky he once fought beneath, the bridge still stands. Steel and stone, held together not by command but by conscience. Because sometimes history doesn't salute the man who followed orders. It salutes the one who didn't.